Hi everyone, Sam Wenzel here from Sam's Woodland Tours, and today I'm doing a little video on one of the many ways you can go about building a fire out in wet conditions. So I'm going to run over some of the principles, gathering a few different materials. Of course, this may vary depending on the time of year, where you are, what you have in hand. But yeah, we're going to do a little video on how I went about lighting this fire. Stay tuned. Okay, so we've got finding our material. We've got a dead standing piece of wood here, and what we're looking for when you're finding dead standing wood, of course it's wet today, so a lot of the punky wood, anything that's kind of rotten, is going to absorb that moisture. But you're looking for either punky or somewhat dry stuff. Punky isn't always great if you're looking to make shavings with it, but sometimes it's the best that you can find. But there is actually quite a bit of thick wood here that's going to work for shavings and going to work for firewood. So you can start off with that too. So there's a little bit of punk, a little bit of knot, and there's some more dead standing pieces around here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Schrade Leroy Bowie and harvest this. So another thing that we're looking for is a good amount of kindling. Now, of course, on a day like today, it's been raining off and on for a good chunk of today and last night, and things are pretty damp. In fact, as you can see, even some of the insides of these twigs are wet. Now, what you're looking for, though, is something that can dry out quickly in a fire. So if you've got a lot of tinder lit, even if you can't find dry wood, is small sticks, because it's easier to get them to dry out. Now they can still be kind of dry. If you hear them snap, that's bordering on dry enough to burn. Actually, they tell you to look for twigs that make a good snapping sound for that. So I'm going to get a good handful of this, something small that'll catch quick, and throw a little bit of heat. And what I like to do is I like to take the lower limbs off of softwood trees, so any of your spruce, your balsam fir, your pine, anything like that, and that just has a little extra resin content as well. So one of the most common tinders there is to find anywhere where you have birch trees is, of course, birch bark. If you're not familiar with the birch tree, it's going to look something like this. They do have it in many parts of the world. Everyone usually knows about birch bark. And what you're looking for, if you have access to it, this is one of the tinders that you can use. What you're looking for, though, when you harvest it, is any birch bark that is hanging off of the tree that's letting go. Because if you take too much, and I'm going to just rip this piece off so I'm not stripping it off around the side. If you start to peel it off and expose the inner bark, you can actually damage the tree. So when you go to harvest birch bark, unless you're taking it for a certain project such as a canoe or something like that, you kind of want to avoid damaging your trees. So if you don't need those perfect sheets for anything and you're just looking for a little bit of tinder or a small amount for something, I suggest trying to harvest the birch bark in a way that's not going to damage your trees, because it'll continue to produce that bark and you can use that for years and years to come, and the tree's going to remain healthy. Another great thing about birch bark is, now some people say it burns even when wet. On the odd occasion here in Nova Scotia, I have had birch bark so wet that it doesn't really want to light even. Those days in January where you've got snow and rain and you got a fog hanging on top of the snow, I've had it so that birch bark just didn't want to go. It was just so wet. So you can get it so it won't burn. That is something I have experienced a few times, so I consider that a little bit of a myth. The reason, though, why people consider it, say that it'll burn even when wet, is because it does have a natural oil inside of it that helps it burn. So one of the first things you're going to want to do before you start gathering materials, or even as you're doing it, sometimes as you're walking through the woods, if you know you're going to want a fire at some point or may need a fire, if you see birch bark or dry twigs hanging somewhere, you might say, hey, I'm going to pull that off the tree and put it in my pocket. But what we need to do is have a site selected. Now I'm going to use the fire pit just because of where I am today. And what I did was I started to clear it of damp debris, and I've put down a base of some of my dryish wood, or dry wood. And the reason why you want to do that is anytime you're working with fire, anything on the ground, anything that can be thrown off by moisture, anything you put down that's dry, if it's on the wet ground rather, it can start to absorb that moisture. In fact, it likely will after a short period of time. So if you're going to start putting your birch bark or your dry twigs on the ground, that may not always work. Same thing with snow. You want to clear away snow and do that sort of thing. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to lay out our materials for the fire, because once you get it lit, you're going to want to have it positioned so that you can feed it quickly. So I'm taking some of my twigs. I'm just going to start to pile those there. I'm going to break those up, small pieces, so that they're ready to go on the fire quickly. Now, if you didn't find your birch bark, and say you didn't have some form of large chopping tool, such as a large chopping knife, for those of us who are interested in those sorts of things, or if you didn't have a tomahawk, hatchet, axe, whatever, smaller knife, you can just get all the materials you need by gathering it by hand. It may take a little bit more looking. So of course, for those who have a chopping or cutting device, tool rather I should say, you take your wood, you take your wood and you would make shavings with it. Those who do have it, you can stop and make shavings with your larger pieces of wood. So what I'm going to do next is where I'm going with birch bark, and I don't need to stop and make shavings because I have it. I'm going to get my birch bark ready to go, and instead of doing this with the ferro rod, I've got some matches I want to try out. And what I've done, I've got it out of my shoulder bag. Now I always have a couple of methods of lighting fire on my person, but on my bag sometimes I have more extra. I've got this little tinder box here, and what I'm just going to do is I'm going to get out some windproof, waterproof storm matches. I'm just going to see how these act. Anytime you take your fire lighting stuff out, or your knife, you want to always replace it. In this case, I've put the lid back on my tinder box because it's got some dry char cloth, cotton balls, ferro rod, extra things like that in there. So I'm just trying out some of these, let's see if I can say it right, the Kolins windproof, waterproof storm matches. And all it is that we've got this tip. It doesn't last as long as some of the other commercially available stormproof matches, but it gives you quite a bit of flame for a short period of time. Give that a go. I'm going to light our birch bark. Now with birch bark, a stormproof match on a non-windy day might be just a little bit of overkill. I set that aside, but as soon as I got my fire going, I'm going to put my ignition source back inside the tinder box so I don't lose it. Now what you want to do, once your birch bark is starting to go, you want to start placing your small thin twigs, or shavings if you've made some, on top. If you've made some feather sticks, you may do some feather stick videos in the future. Now would be a good time to place them on. And as your small stuff starts to catch, you want to gradually switch to your bigger pieces of wood. Slowly. You don't want to smother your fire. And of course, as you might be seeing from the camera, that this smokes quite a bit. Now for two reasons. One, because a lot of this material is kind of damp, just because we have a damp day. It's a low overcast day, so the smoke's going to stay close to the ground. And of course, birch bark in itself is quite often can be smoky. Now for those of you who hunt or are into nature photography, you're going out in the woods to see wildlife, whatever the reason, just be aware that the oil, the tar that is burning in birch bark is rumored to be, I haven't of course done a lot of research on this, but rumored to be an unpleasant smell for some animals. Now that's not to say that you won't see any animals after your clothes and your skin and hair has been smoked up by birch bark smoke, but apparently, according to a few sources, that may not help you. I quite like the smell though. So there's different ways of doing this. Of course, we could do the furnace method or the TP method. Today I'm just kind of slowly adding stuff on here. And again, we've had quite a bit of rain in the last couple days here in Nova Scotia. And the reason why building a fire in the wet is a good skill to have anywhere, but especially here, is we have a tendency of having kind of a damp fall, winter, even spring. Last few years we've had some fairly dry summers, but so here in Nova Scotia you want to have multiple ways of lighting fire in damp conditions with you whenever you're going out in the woods. And in other videos I may talk a little bit more about carried tinder, but today, since I had a birch tree pretty close by, I thought I'd make use of what I have. Always figure out what you have around you, what you have on your person, what kind of resources you have in the area around you or that you can gather as you go, and make use of them for whatever you need. And of course, if you don't need it, maybe consider leaving it. So now I'm starting to graduate to some of the placing some larger pieces of wood on. I say that as I pull a small stick out. I'll put this one on and I'll start putting some bigger ones on. But as you build up a bed of coals, eventually you'll be able to put larger pieces of wood and possibly even damper pieces of wood on once you build up enough heat. And of course, this works great if you have a break in the rain, and we're fortunate to have this little pause in the rain today where I can stop and film. Part of the reason why I did that is because I didn't really want to expose the somewhat expensive camera to a heavy downpour. If you're in a heavy downpour though, it's quite difficult to get a fire going. It challenges you a little bit more, or quite a bit more. It is fun. It is a fun challenge to do, but what I'd recommend for that is build your fire in somewhat of a sheltered area, someplace out of the wind, and possibly with something overhead, but something overhead that's not going to catch fire from your embers and heat and flames. That's very important. So no flammable tarps, no, and of course no lower limbs of trees that are going to ignite. But you'd want to, if you are out in a downpour and you feel like you want a fire, you want to have something. See if you can go somewhere where it's not going to be a problem. Otherwise, you got to risk it out in the open. Okay, well, as you can see, put my larger pieces on. I'm going to set that one right there. And there you have it. How to light fire out in the wet, and wet conditions here in Nova Scotia. This is December. So if you found this video useful, or if you have anything to input, feel free to comment down below. Of course, different environments, different situations, different amounts of moisture, times of the year will affect this, so there's different techniques. But yeah, if you found this video useful, or if you liked it, feel free to comment, subscribe, click like, and as always, thank you for watching.